Welcome to The Debate. Today, we are tackling one of the most fundamental questions in education. What is the absolute most effective method for acquiring a new language?
Right, specifically how we build true communicative competence in a learner.
Exactly. Should language learners prioritize communicative language teaching, focusing on pragmatics and the memorization of formulaic phrases for immediate, real-world use?
Or must they first build a rigorous structural foundation through traditional teaching methods and repetitive audiolingual drills? I will be arguing for the traditional approach. Emphasizing grammatical structure, repetition, and accuracy is really the only way to build a sustainable proficiency that actually holds up under pressure in the real world.
And I am advocating for the communicative approach. My position is that language is primarily a tool for social interaction, not just some rigid set of rules. Focusing on pragmatics in formulaic phrases is the fastest, most effective way to generate authentic communication and give learners the confidence to actually speak.
But speaking isn't the same as making sense. I mean, we have to separate the illusion of speaking from the reality of knowing the language.
It's not an illusion. It is the very purpose of human connection. Let's just jump right into the core of the issue here. Language is a living, breathing mechanism. It's not a sterile math equation to be memorized in a vacuum.
Well,
That is exactly why communicative language teaching, or CLT, is vastly superior. We have this entire concept from Delheim's of communicative competence. The idea that just knowing grammar is practically useless if you don't have a functional social understanding of how and when to use the language. And the way we achieve that quickly is by teaching what linguists call formulaic sequences.
Which is just a fancy term for memorizing phrases.
It's more than just memorizing phrases. It's about cognitive processing. These are fixed expressions, phrasal verbs like put on or look up, or idioms like in a nutshell. When a beginner learns these formulaic sequences as single, ready-made blocks of meaning, they bypass the massive cognitive load of having to mentally translate grammar rules. They don't have to pause, search their vocabulary, conjugate a verb, and find an object. They can speak fluently and participate in real communication immediately.
But fluency isn't the same as proficiency. That is the crucial distinction you are glossing over. Relying purely on those communicative chunks is a superficial shortcut. Fluency is just the smoothness of speech. Proficiency is the ability to communicate accurately in spontaneous, unrehearsed contexts. A learner might sound incredibly fluent because they memorized a handful of expressions like piece of cake or in a nutshell, but their actual proficiency is near zero, because the second a conversation goes off script, they are paralyzed.
Paralyzed? Or just learning on the job, because those chunks, those lexical bundles, actually prevent the agonizing, awkward pauses that completely kill a real-world conversation.
I disagree. They just delay the awkward pause by about 10 seconds. What happens when the native speaker asks them to explain why something was a piece of cake? The learner freezes. They have no grammatical foundation to formulate an original thought. Traditional teaching methods, particularly the audiolingual method, provide that indispensable grounding. We use repetitive drills, inflection, replacement, restatement. Without that intense pattern practice, students remain forever trapped, just mimicking what they've heard like parrots.
Yeah, but what you call mimicking is actually a cognitive life raft. Let's think about a real-world scenario. You're in a foreign country, you're in a crowded train station, and you need to get through a wall of people. Do you want the student pausing to mentally construct the grammatically rigorous sentence, "May I pass, please?"
Well, obviously.
No. If you pause to conjugate your verbs and check your syntax in that environment, you lose the moment. People bump into you. You cause confusion.
So what is the alternative? Just shouting vocabulary words at them?
The alternative is the formulaic chunk. Excuse me. It gets an immediate real-world result. The crowd parts, the student successfully navigates society effortlessly. Speed and social outcome matter far more in that moment than perfect underlying grammar.
Effortlessly, only until they run out of memorized chunks. You are confusing surviving a brief 2-second encounter with actually speaking a language. You say excuse me is enough, but what if the person replies, I can't move right now, my bag is stuck in the door? Your communicative learner has no underlying structure to process that unexpected response. They're going to stare blankly at the person because they never learned how passive verbs or relative clauses work.
They won't stare blankly if we prioritize teaching pragmatics, the actual social context of language. This is the heartbeat of communicative language teaching. We aren't just handing them flashcards. We are teaching cultural sensitivity and modern usage. We teach them how to read the room.
You can't read a room if you don't know the alphabet.
Let me give you a perfect example of why pragmatics matter more than drills. The phrase, take a rain check. A learner desperately needs to know that this means, I want to politely postpone without burning bridges. It is a friendly delay full of implied goodwill, perfect for skipping a casual lunch. More importantly, they need the pragmatic awareness to know when not to use it. You don't use a rain check for a major commitment. If someone invites you to their wedding, you don't reply, hey, about your wedding, rain check? That is a massive social blunder. A traditional grammar drill will never teach you that nuance. Only communicative and pragmatic instruction does.
You can't just tell a beginner to say, I beg to differ, without explaining how strong that sounds. And you certainly can't tell a beginner to say, take a rain check, without explaining the underlying grammar or ensuring they have the proficiency to continue the resulting conversation. You throw them a slang term and assume they are communicating. What if the native speaker replies to that rain check by saying, sure, what day works better for you next week?
Then they negotiate meaning. They use their foundational vocabulary.
How? If the student hasn't done the traditional drills on days of the week, future tense conjugations, and question formulations, they are completely lost. They initiated a conversation they do not have the structural tools to finish. Communicative teaching throws students into the deep end with unstructured, authentic materials, unscripted interactions, rapid-fire slang, long before they are ready. It's overwhelming. It creates massive anxiety because the learner knows they are standing on thin ice.
Actually, it's the traditional audiolingual method that creates anxiety because it traps students in a shallow, artificial puddle where making a single mistake is punished. Audiolingualism relies entirely on static, mechanical drills. The student has absolutely zero control of their own output.
They shouldn't have control yet. They don't know the language.
But treating them like robots doesn't help. Picture the traditional classroom. The teacher holds up a cup and says, there's a cup on the table. And the students blindly echo, there's a cup on the table. The teacher says spoon, and the students swap the word. There's a spoon on the table. If they mispronounce a syllable, they receive immediate negative feedback. It's pure behaviorism. It's conditioning them like laboratory animals rather than teaching them how to connect with humans. Communicative teaching empowers the student with interactive activities, role plays, and group discussions where they actually have to figure out how to convey a message.
But what you are calling robotic, cognitive scientists call the generative principle. It is the most beautiful, powerful concept in language acquisition. By doing those replacement drills, cup, spoon, book, the learner isn't just mindlessly echoing. They are internalizing the finite grammatical framework needed to generate an infinite number of sentences. Yes, it's heavily controlled by the teacher. Yes, it restricts their output initially, but you have to restrict the variables so the student can master the mechanics.
Mastering mechanics at the expense of meaning is a hollow victory.
It's not at the expense of meaning. It's the prerequisite for it. If you just throw a beginner into a free-flowing role play to negotiate meaning, they are just guessing. Worse, they are practicing their own errors. They cobble together a broken, grammatically incorrect sentence, the native speaker politely nods to save face, and the learner thinks, great, I nailed it. That leads to fossilization. They permanently bake those errors into their brain.
But those mechanical drills lack any authentic context. Traditional structuralism treats grammar as an end in itself. Everything is just memorized in form without prioritizing what the speaker actually wants to say. CLT promotes authentic language use. By integrating speaking, listening, reading, and writing in a holistic way, learners develop actual cultural competence. They use authentic texts, real conversations, real media, which prepares them for the messy, diverse cultural context they will actually face in the real world.
I hear the word authentic thrown around constantly by CLT advocates, but let's look at actual empirical data on how well these empowered students perform in the real world. Just look at the recent, highly detailed data out of Acquet College. Researchers tested this exact communicative approach. The instructors used all of your favorite methods: interactive communicative activities, role plays, pair work, group discussions. And what happened when those students stepped off campus? A staggering 63% of them reported that they still struggle to apply pragmatic norms in real informal communication.
Let's contextualize that 63%.
They explicitly stated that while they understood the theory of speaking politely, they found it incredibly difficult to actually use the language in informal settings with friends. Why? Because informal conversations move at lightning speed. This proves that without a rigid, drilled grammatical foundation, learners fall apart in the real world. Role plays are not enough. If you don't drill the structure until it is automatic, they cannot process native speech in real time.
I see why you focus on the 63% who struggled with informal peer slang, but let's look at the rest of that exact same data set. That study overwhelmingly concluded that pragmatic instruction gave those students superpowers when it came to navigating power dynamics. Nearly half of the students, 48%, specifically cited navigating power hierarchies as their biggest challenge. Communicative and pragmatic instruction gave them the exact tools to address their professors properly, respectfully, and effectively. Traditional methods completely ignore this.
Traditional methods teach them how to form a coherent sentence so the professor actually understands their question.
But how you frame the question matters just as much as the syntax. Traditional teaching focuses purely on rote memorization of grammar rules. It leaves students completely unequipped to avoid cross-cultural social blunders. Someone trained exclusively in the audiolingual method might use perfect subject-verb agreement to say something wildly inappropriate or offensive to an authority figure, simply because no one ever taught them the cultural context of politeness. They might confidently walk up to a university dean and demand, "Give me the paper now," with perfect grammar, totally unaware of how aggressive they sound.
I'm not saying we ignore politeness. I'm saying that ignoring grammar to focus on politeness is putting the cart before the horse. The Acquet College students themselves noted that the communicative tasks in the classroom often felt disconnected from their rapid, informal interactions outside, because informal conversation requires an absolute automaticity of structure. You cannot calculate power dynamics, choose the right polite idiom, and read the room if your brain is currently using 100% of its processing power just to figure out how to conjugate an irregular verb.
Which brings us right back to formulaic sequences. The whole point of teaching lexical chunks early is to free up that processing power. Native speakers don't sit around calculating syntax in casual conversation either. They use lexical bundles. They say, by the way, at the end of the day, to be honest. If you teach these chunks early, learners can jump into the flow of conversation immediately.
Jumping into the flow without knowing how to swim is dangerous. The structural backbone provided by traditional drills is what gives a student the mental bandwidth to eventually think about pragmatics. If you skip the drills, their foundation crumbles the second they leave the carefully curated classroom environment. Think of it like architecture. If an architect builds a house with a flawed foundation, you don't praise them because the house hasn't fallen down yet. You don't say, well, the paint looks authentic. You correct the foundation.
But language isn't a building, it's a behavior. Furthermore, the way traditional methods correct the foundation is intensely demotivating. Error correction in a communicative classroom focuses on helping learners convey their message effectively. We don't punish them for a minor grammatical slip if the meaning is clear. This fosters a supportive environment where they actually feel comfortable taking risks. Your audiolingual approach, with its immediate negative feedback for every mispronounced syllable, just creates an affective filter. The student becomes so anxious about making a mistake that they just shut down and stop speaking entirely.
Anxiety or rigorous standards? It is a profound disservice to a learner to let them permanently fossilize bad grammar just because they successfully conveyed a basic message once. Yes, purely audiolingual methods from the 1960s had flaws. We learned that from massive longitudinal data like the Pennsylvania Project. But replacing structure entirely with unstructured communicative tasks is a massive overcorrection. A strong grammatical foundation is absolutely non-negotiable for academic writing, advanced comprehension, and professional success. You cannot write a college thesis or negotiate a complex business contract using only formulaic slang and memorized phrasal verbs.
No one is suggesting they write a college thesis in slang, but you have to get them speaking first. Language is acquired through interaction. If you wait until their grammar is perfect before you let them have a meaningful conversation, they will lose all motivation and quit. The data clearly shows that communicative teaching leads to higher levels of learner satisfaction and increased motivation exactly because they feel they are using the language for real, tangible purposes right from day one.
But is it a real purpose if they don't actually understand the mechanics of what they are saying? When they say, take a rain check, do they know what check functions as in that sentence? Do they know it's a noun? If not, they are just performing a parlor trick.
It's not a parlor trick. It's the natural order of human acquisition. Think about how a child learns their first language. They don't sit in a crib parsing grammar rules. They learn chunks. They learn I want or give me. They use those formulaic sequences naturally to get their needs met, and they subconsciously segment and analyze the grammar years later. CLT simply replicates this natural biological acquisition process. Yes, we are teaching adults, but the human brain's reliance on these multi-word chunks to reduce processing load remains exactly the same.
That is a fundamental, dangerous misunderstanding of adult second language acquisition. Adults are not infants. Adults already possess a fully developed, highly complex first language. They don't acquire a second language the way a baby does because their brain is already hardwired to the rules of their mother tongue. They require explicit, systematic, structural instruction to actively overcome the interference from their native language. That is exactly why the repetitive drills of the audiolingual method are so crucial. They systematically overwrite the deeply ingrained habits of the first language. Without that mechanical practice, you just end up with students speaking a heavily translated, grammatically fractured version of their native tongue, masked by a few flashy English idioms.
We have covered a tremendous amount of ground today, unpacking the deep cognitive and social mechanisms behind how we learn to speak. If I were to summarize the absolute heart of my position, it is this. Language is alive. Prioritizing communicative competence, pragmatics, and interactive activities is the only way to truly equip a learner to connect with native speakers. Formulaic sequences provide the immediate fluency needed to survive and thrive in real, rapid-fire conversations. If we don't teach students how the language is actually used in society, the slang, the politeness markers, the cultural nuances of power dynamics, we are completely failing them, regardless of how perfectly they can conjugate a verb on a multiple-choice written test.
And my summary is that while human connection is a wonderful, noble goal, the structural integrity of the language simply cannot be ignored. Without the rigorous backbone of grammatical accuracy and the automaticity gained from traditional, repetitive drills, a learner's foundation will eventually crumble. You cannot build a durable linguistic house out of disconnected, memorized phrasebook chunks. True proficiency, the ability to generate your own complex, spontaneous, original thoughts accurately, requires a deep, internalized mastery of the language's mechanics. Skipping that step in favor of immediate superficial fluency is a massive disservice to the learner's long-term success.
Despite our deep, passionate disagreements on methodology today, I think we are actually circling a very pragmatic middle ground here. When we look at those formulaic sequences we've been debating all hour, let's say those core 120 phrases that pop up in almost every single beginner curriculum across the globe, we can probably agree that they form the perfect essential foundation for any beginner to start speaking immediately.
I can certainly agree to that truce. Learning those 120 phrases gives a beginner a vital starting block. It lowers the barrier to entry and gives them the confidence to open their mouth. However, as we have both argued today, those 120 phrases are completely useless without real-world common sense, meaning the pragmatic awareness of when and how to use them contextually, backed by an eventual rigorous structural proficiency. You can't just throw out a phrase without knowing its social weight and its underlying mechanics.
Exactly right. The formulaic phrases are the key that opens the door to the conversation, but the pragmatic awareness of how to treat the person on the other side of that door, combined with the structural grammar to express your own original thoughts, that is what allows you to actually stay in the room and build a lasting relationship.
Well said. There are incredibly strong evidence-based arguments for both the immediate communicative approach and the traditional structural approach. Both tap into different mechanisms of the human brain. We will leave it to our listeners to weigh the data and form their own conclusions on the balance between language fluency and proficiency.
Thank you for joining us on The Debate.